Welcome to GraceLife Church. I'm David Kinneberg, one of the teaching elders here at GraceLife. We want to thank you for joining us online and listening to our sermons online. Hope they are a blessing and encouragement to you. If you want more information, you can check out our website at glcanoka.org. Thanks and God bless. We're back into Revelation chapter 12 today. As you may be turning there, as we're preparing, I don't know if you've noticed the news about what has happened in Germany this past week. Apparently, about 9 days ago, there was a forecast that because of weather conditions, that there was going to be extreme flooding. And Germany has 5 major river basins. So I've never been to Germany. Some of you may have. I'm assuming that it's nice and green, and that's the pictures I see, but it has the 5 major river basins. Apparently there's been a lot of pouring of concrete and draining and straightening of rivers and stuff like that. So the conditions are prime there for flooding. Within 24 hours before any flooding occurred, they said this was going to be a major devastation. And if you've seen any of the pictures, it was accurate. Buildings wiped away, torn into, cars wrapped around trees and crushed. One of the responses to the whole situation was this: what's the use of having, it was to the point, the accuracy of the forecast was to the point of being prophetic to the degree that it was accurate. All the computer modeling and everything. And one person questioned, why do we have all of this if we're not going to respond to it? Because it was a fully inadequate response. Nearly 200 people dead, probably more once they find what has happened. There's hundreds of people missing. And it looks like devastation. One of the worst natural disasters in Germany in decades, if not centuries. And they knew. They were forewarned. So we look in the book of Revelation, and we're in Revelation chapter 12. Chapter 12 is looking at signs. Now the signs, we looked at the first sign, and really the second sign. There's probably smaller signs that fit into them, but there's 2 great signs that are in Revelation chapter 12. One is Israel in the birth of the Messiah. And we didn't, just to remind you, a couple of weeks ago we went through that. Israel, the woman that's pictured in Revelation chapter 12, the one with the sun and the 12 stars as a crown and the moon at her feet, is a picture of Israel. And the birth it's not Mary, it's Israel. And the birth is Jesus Christ the Messiah. He ascends. There's also this great dragon, which is representative of Satan. So there's 2 things 2 signs: the great dragon and the woman. Those are 2 great signs. What are they signs of? When we put up signs, we just don't put up signs randomly with no meaning. Though I do have recently from a garage sale find, unauthorized vehicles will be towed away. I got that at a garage sale. That is in my garage now. So you're all forewarned. And there is an advantage. Don't park in my garage. You will be towed away. Now, I think that's probably for me, because my wife's car is the only one that gets into her garage. But these 2 great signs, what are they signs of? What are they pointing to? They're pointing to the arrival of the King, the establishment of Jesus Christ's rule and reign on earth. In fact, that's what we're told the Son was for. He's going to rule with a rod of iron. The great shepherd king is going to once again rule and reign as the plan. He is going to have his kingdom on earth. And those signs point towards that. And there's 2 signs again, Israel in the birth of the Messiah, and Satan and his attack and all the processes that are going to go out. So when we look in this passage here, we're going to see the way that Israel is going to be treated, and we're going to see the activities of Satan. And we can see these activities, and it's actually a little disconcerting and a little bit frightful, but we need to remember these bad things happen to point towards the great thing, which is Christ returning and ruling and reigning. Let's go to the Lord in word of prayer and ask for his blessing on our time in his word. Dear Heavenly Father, as we come before you, I thank you that you forewarn us, you tell us of what is going to occur. It's not going to be a shock, it's not going to be a surprise, but Lord, you have planned out, you have prepared, and it is going to occur. Dear Heavenly Father, as we look into this passage, give us understanding and let us apply the truths to our life. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, we stopped at 12 and verse 5. We'll read that for context here, and then we'll jump into verses 6 and following. Verse 5, it says, she gave birth to a male child, referring to Israel, the woman of Revelation 12, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Whose throne? God's throne? No, it's talking about Christ's throne. It's referring to the ascension of Christ. By the way, why do we know Jesus Christ is going to return? Because he arrived the first time. Why do we know he is going to return to reign on earth? Because he is ascended to heaven and he is on his throne right now. And the woman fled into the wilderness, and there was a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now, the difference between Revelation 5 and verse 6 is at the very least nearly 2,000 years. Who knows? It could be 3,000 years. We don't know when Christ is returning, though I expect Christ's return, and there's two returns, for the rapture, for his saints, and at the second coming, which is the second where he returns with his saints. But it should be, and it could be any moment. And it could be 1 year, 1 month, 1 minute. But Christ is returning. And there is a huge separation, though, in between Revelation 12, verse 5, and verse 6. Again, nearly 2,000 years at this point. And what we're beginning to look at is the midpoint of the tribulation. The middle point of the tribulation, things ramp up and the difficulty and struggle for humanity increases. We find out the reason for that in verse 7 here. Now war arose in heaven. Let's just stop there. That is an amazing thing to think about. War in heaven. Now, I encourage you not to think of heaven as in, okay, somewhere in outer space. Isn't there that song, Somewhere in Outer Space, God has prepared a place for those who trust and obey? That's not a very biblical view, actually, of heaven. It's not somewhere off, somewhere away. It's a difference of existence. And I don't want to go too far on this and be too philosophical, but it's the difference between spiritual and material. Heaven is a spiritual realm. It's different than the material. Something that's unique about humanity and is very special is we're the only creature that is designed to be both spiritual and material. We live in material realm, but we are spiritual beings. God is spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. In this case, there is war in the spiritual realm. Now, this isn't something new. There has been conflict, spiritual conflict, since Satan rebelled. And he took a third of the angels in rebellion with him. But one thing that we'll see here in Revelation chapter 12 is that Satan, as of yet, still has access in the spiritual realm to the presence of God. There will be some applications here that we see in a moment. Now, all this is used in past tense, which is an amazing thing to consider. As we're prophetically looking at this, John is looking at what is occurring, and he's relating what is occurring in the future in past tense. So don't let that confuse you. This isn't something that has happened, and we're giving a review of it. It's something that John is looking forward to, seeing occurring, and relating it to us as past tense. Is that confusing enough? So this is the situation. It's something that is going to occur in the future. At the midpoint of the tribulation, there is going to be open war in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. So there begins to be a war. And as you see here, it says Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. There's a point where enough is enough, and Satan is going to be moved out of the heavenly realm, and that is going to be done away with. And it says here, Michael and his angels begin the fight here, and the dragon and his angels, they fight back, but he is defeated. There is no longer any place for them in heaven. Now, we'll see what that place in heaven right now is like. That is something that's a little mind-blowing. We can read in Job, which is the oldest book of the Bible, is that Satan still has a place in heaven. And we'll see what that activity looks like when we look at his names here. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient servant who is called the devil and Satan. Now, there's three things here that we need to look about Satan. First of all, the great dragon. And he's referred to as that great serpent. I said servant, but serpent. This is connecting Revelation back to Genesis and letting us know that the serpent in Genesis is the same one that is the devil and Satan. There's two names here that are used of Satan that are important to remember. First one is the devil, or diabolos. He is the accuser. And it tells us what his activity is right now. We can learn that from Job when we see him going into heaven and sneaking around, and he wants to question the integrity of Job. What is Satan doing in the heavenly realms right now? Hey, God, do you see Dan? He says he loves you, but here's some examples of him not doing it. He got angry at the guy that pulled out in front of him. I don't know. Maybe Dan doesn't do that. I do that. Maybe a little projection there. Somebody pulls out and goes really slow. Okay, did you see Dave? How he reacted? And that's what Satan's doing. Maybe, just see how he treated his wife just now. Satan is an accuser of the brethren. That should give us a little pause when we think about how we act and behave. One of the things that my parents did, and I don't think it's proper parenting, I would discourage it. Whenever we'd go out, they'd say, remember, you represent our family. Don't embarrass the family. I don't think that's a good idea because it teaches the fear of man. Be worried about what other people think of you. There's a much better thing that we need to be thinking about, and that is how we relate to God. In Matthew, we're told, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Something that is entirely contrary to doing what is right in our day-to-day life is doing things that are sinful. And it's very opposite of worship. Because what happens when I do sinful things? There's a great import to it because it's almost anti-worship if you want to, because guess what Satan is doing with that? Oh, look at that. Now, fortunately, we have an advocate, which is Jesus Christ, and he says, you know what? That's been paid for. That sin Dave just committed, that's been paid for. We have an advocate in heaven. But we had this adversarial lawyer here, this prosecuting attorney called Satan, which is the second term here is Satan, which means adversary. He is busy, he is active. And this is something that we cannot forget, is that we do have an adversary. We look in the world and we say, this is crazy. It doesn't make sense. So many of these things are just, If you just use your brain, you'd know you shouldn't be doing that. Why is there so many foolish things that are occurring? Because there's spiritual warfare going on. And if we don't have that as part of our understanding, we're going to not understand the world as it is. Look at another thing that is describing Satan here. Really, I said there's three, but there's four descriptions here. The deceiver of the whole world. Not just part of the world, but the whole world. Satan is very active in deception. There's a number of ways that he deceives. World religions, false religions. Atheism is a form, which is really a form of religion, by the way. It's a belief. Atheism is a belief. It's not just, I'm a non-believer. It's a belief in the way reality is. Satan deceives through that. By the way, you might be familiar with Ricky Gervais, the comedian. I was watching an interview, and he said, one reason why I'm an atheist is because you say there's a God. Well, there's 6,000 gods, and I'm supposed to pick out of one of those. The reality is, you don't have to go and search out all 6,000 gods and figure out which one is right. There's, I think it's Frank Turek was talking about it. There's really, I'll simplify it, not quite as simplified as what he puts it. You really have to decide between some form of pantheism or atheism or theism, monotheism. That makes it pretty simple. So if I'm going to go for monotheism, there's really only three monotheisms that I need to look at: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And then I just need to investigate which one of those are true. Fortunately for Christianity, there's a multitude of tests. Prophecy, we've talked about a lot of them from the pulpit, both Steve and I. A good example is Steve and Daniel. You could go look it up. He gave the good overview of the prophecy of when Christ would return to the exact day. There's a prophecy in Daniel that gives the exact day that Christ would enter into Jerusalem triumphantly. That is amazing. It is impossible beyond the fact that Jesus Christ was who he said he was. Christianity is true. There's so many ways to prove it. Therefore, I believe in Christianity because it's true. Not just because I feel it's true, it's because I know it's true. But Satan is a deceiver. He deceives through all these false ideas. But one of the greatest ways that he deceives the world is going by saying, you know what God has given? It's not good enough. He's holding something back from you. Isn't that exactly what happens in Genesis? You know what? The whole garden, it's not enough. That one tree, he's holding back something from you. God's goodness isn't good enough. We see this in the book of Judges. We see this quite active. God blesses Israel. They prosper. Things are going really well. And then they go, you know what? This isn't quite good enough. And they start following after the idolatry around them, and then they're right back into slavery. That's the situation. Think about Satan. As much as he deceives the world, he has experienced the greatest self-deception ever. He was experiencing the blessings of heaven. And what did he do? It's not good enough. Serving God isn't good enough. I need to be God. That's really the deception that he brings to the world. That discontent, that God's goodness is not enough. He is a deceiver of the whole world. Look at the promised results that's going to occur. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Again, he is moved out of the spiritual realm, and he's cast down to the earth. And I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers have been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. By the way, that's a pretty horrible description of what Satan is doing right now. This is a future event. Guess what he's doing right now? He is busy accusing believers. And that is his not just his hobby, not just his avocation, it is his vocation, day and night. It's a constant accuser. But when he is cast down, what does it say? Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of Christ has come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down. What's happening in the book of Revelation? God is bringing back the authority over mankind, over creation, and this idea of salvation. Oftentimes, we concentrate on personal salvation. I personally appreciate that. Appreciate the fact that I am personally saved, born again, redeemed. You can pile up the adjectives. I am thankful for that. But there's a salvation aspect, and there's an idea of salvation that goes even beyond that. And that is where God is bringing everything under His authority and control. That's looking towards that millennial kingdom, which the tribulation period is the prologue to that short period before that occurs. Verse 11, here's something that's very interesting when we think about that spiritual warfare. Who's fighting this battle? In verse 7, we find out it's Michael and his angels. But look at verse 11. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives unto death. Who is the they referring to? The antecedent, to do a little grammar here, is referring back to our brothers. If you think of it, the accuser of our brothers is Satan, who is the ones that are conquering. Our brothers have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives unto death. How is Satan conquered? It's through the blood of Christ, and there's a very important element here where the testimony and the lives of believers are very connected to the defeat of Satan. Look at verse 12. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows his time is short. What happens when Satan is cast out of heaven? He's no longer enjoying whatever privileges he still had. The accuser of the brother isn't accusing anyone anymore. He has been cast out. What happens? He knows something. Again, as I said, Satan is the most deceived being that walks on the face of the earth. I honestly think right now he's thinking, I got this. Look at the world. They're doing what I want. Yeah, there's Christians, but we'll take care of them. We'll discredit them. We'll mock them. We'll kill them when we get the chance. I got this. I'm going to win. I'm going to defeat God. I think that's what he's thinking. At the midpoint of the tribulation, when he's cast out of the spiritual realm and he is cast to earth, you know what he's going to do? Oh no, I'm in trouble. And he's going to cause the most havoc that he can, because guess what? His time is short. I don't want to be, and I'm glad I'm not going to be there on the earth during this time. Now look at his reaction. And it still continues this imagery of the dragon and the lady. And the lady again is Israel here. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to a place where she is to be nourished for a time, a times, and a half time. So 3.5 years is really the idea, that 1,260 days. At the midpoint of tribulation, up to this point, there has been, and there's going to be more details on this, up to the midpoint of tribulation, there's been this peace in the Middle East. Israel has peace for approximately 3.5 years. At the midpoint, Satan begins taking his wrath out on Israel. This is in Matthew chapter 24. It talks about, hey, when this happens, just as a woman, you don't want to be pregnant at this time. You don't want to be on top of a roof. You want to be where you can escape and get away, because this wrath is going to come down and there's going to be an attack upon Israel. We could look at Ezekiel 38, and it has some context to this as well. We're not going to turn there. Now, I'll refer to that in a moment here, but the serpent poured out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep after her with a flood. So there's going to be an attack on Israel. Israel that has turned their hearts back to Jehovah God. And Satan and his government is going to sweep down and try to destroy Israel. Most likely, this is referring to, in Ezekiel, talks about to the nations to the north. Could be Syria, Turkey, Russia, or a combination of those three, sweeping down into Israel to attack and destroy her. But God says here in verse 16, but the earth came to help the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Now, again, this is imagery. What is happening is there going to be a giant dragon right above Israel pouring out water on Israel. Now, we know this is imagery being used to communicate something. Satan, the adversary, is going to want to destroy the people that have brought out Messiah. Now, who knows? Maybe it's out of revenge against them setting up Christ. Maybe it's a desperate ploy to keep Christ from ruling and reigning. Maybe it's, again, like talked about a couple of weeks ago. If he can destroy Israel, and Israel not possess the land that God has promised, if they do not receive the promises that God has given, and he can wipe them out, then he feels he can defeat God, because then God is a liar. But as we see in this flood is often used to describe armies or difficulties or struggles. You might think could it be words, where he's saying boastful things against them? No, I think it's a literal flood of armies coming into the nation of Israel to destroy every Israelite that there is. And what happens? The earth swallows them up. I believe this is something that literally happens. In Ezekiel 38, it talks about the mountains shaking and falling. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but if you ever are standing on wet ground, maybe muddy ground, start moving back and forth. If you do it enough, what's going to happen? You're going to sink down into it. God is going to send an earthquake as Israel is being invaded, and as they're fleeing away from this army, God's going to send an earthquake. The mountains are going to fall and wipe out some of this army, and the earth itself, if you shake the earth enough, if you ever want to try this, you can get a bucket of sand, and if you start shaking the sand will come loose and it'll almost become like a fluid. God is going to swallow up the army that goes in to destroy Israel. It's a pretty amazing thing that God has prepared to protect the people that are his own. Verse 17, then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Now, verse 17 is very interesting. Satan, in the midpoint of the tribulation, seeks to destroy Israel, and it doesn't work out very well. What is his next option? There becomes the desire here, and it says in the second portion of verse 17, and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. So the offspring here, first of all, is speaking of Israel and the people of Israel. What's the rest of her offspring? Now, the church is gone at this point, but we know in the book of Revelation there's going to be nations that turn their hearts to God. We have 144,000 Jewish people that are going about the world preaching the gospel of the kingdom, the returning king, the Savior that has died on the cross. They're preaching that gospel. There's actual angels during the tribulation that go about the earth proclaiming the gospel. There's going to be thousands, millions, maybe even billions of people that turn to God during the tribulation. What's Satan going to do? Well, if I can't get them, I'm going to attack the others and seek to destroy them. And it's interesting, the description of them. On those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus, and he stood on the sand of the sea. One of the things that happens during great persecution is there becomes a great clarity of testimony. You know, when it's easy to be a Christian, there's people that will say, yeah, I'll be one of those. But when there's difficulty and struggle and persecution with it, I don't want that. During the tribulation, it is going to be expensive to express your belief in God. And there will be those that suffer for it. Okay, this is a pretty dramatic thing that occurs. We see the pivot point here in the middle of the tribulation. What are some things that we can take away from it? First of all, there is spiritual warfare going on. Yeah, who knows? It could be a year, 10 years, 100 years before Christ returns. It could be that long before the rapture happens and all this occurs. I don't see that as being the case. Seems like the times are ramping up and preparing for the tribulation. Regardless of that, there is spiritual warfare going on. We need to conduct our lives with that in mind. Second of all, Christ is returning. He is going to establish his kingdom. This is, I think, the big takeaway that oftentimes we miss from the book of Revelation. There's going to be a day that we rule and reign with Jesus Christ. That's one of the responsibilities of the church. It's very easy to get focused on living here in this life, get rooted in the dirt of this world, and that is our existence. But the way we're described in the New Testament is that we're just pilgrims. We're just transients. We're living in tents. This isn't our permanent place. Our permanent place is going to be in the kingdom of God. Yes, we're going to be ruling and reigning on the earth with him. But it's not in this time. It's not in this place. We need to be living as those that are going to be ruling in his kingdom. What does his kingdom look like? How should we look? How should we be preparing to rule and reign? A third thing is, if there is a spiritual warfare, we should expect some suffering and difficulty that goes along with it. Now, with that being said, on the other side, when we don't live with that expectation of struggle and conflict, oftentimes we provide the accuser of the brethren opportunities to really anti-worship God. Satan right now is busy doing that. And again, thankfully we have our advocate. We have Jesus Christ that is standing up there defending the accusations. But let's not give Satan things to accuse us of that have truth to it. Now again, we could go and look at Job. God used Satan and his accusations and his attacks to work in Job's life and to present some spiritual truth. But we need to realize part of that spiritual warfare is how we conduct our daily life.